Okay, I think Mira, maybe we should start. And Brendan, if people come in, just let them in as they come in. Welcome everybody. Thank you again for joining. For those who have been here before, and welcome to any new people who haven't been here before. We have Miro tonight, or today, and I'll pass over to him. I hope everybody can see the slides on their screen already, and we'll let Miro take over. And Miro, please introduce yourself and start your presentation. We're looking forward to that.
Great, thank you, Avigail. Hello, everyone. I'm Miró. I'm an Egyptian and I currently live in the UK. Today, I'll talk about the chapter 9 of Ilan Pappé's book, 10 Myths About Israel. This chapter is titled The Gaza Mythologies. With everything going on, and as Abigail was just saying, it was harder to discuss this chapter because of what is happening again to our families in Palestine, especially in Gaza. But while our hearts with Gaza and the West Bank, our minds remain focused on spreading the word fairly effectively. So I was thrilled when I heard Ilan in the opening session talking about Edward Said's influence on his book, a connection that I had always sensed, but only fully realized when he mentioned it explicitly. So in an acknowledgement of this, some of the reflections I will share are borrowed from Edward Said. Some of the photos here, actually all of the photos here are from a book called 10 Days in Gaza, that just tries to photograph the daily lives of Palestinian people, though I only got like a few pictures of that. So, yeah. Can you please mute? Thank you. Okay, so I'll start with just a quick summary of chapter 8 because I think it is relevant to things that we're going to discuss here. The Oslo Mythologies, chapter 8, in which Pape suggested that it was a strategic maneuver under the guise of peace process. This is a pattern that we will repeat in chapter 9, as we will see later. So the negotiation process was heavily favorable to Israel due to the imbalance of power. So this also reminds me of Abigail's question last time about whether there could be negotiation with the colonizer. And I think to some extent, yes, but once they're kind of forced to come to the table, either by the resistance of the colonized local or regional international movements or a collection of that multiple factors. So this also highlights the efforts to put pressure on international institutions, governments, universities to isolate Israel, and also the BDS movement's role in eventually forcing Israel to come to the table, but that time will be without preconditions. So as a result of the imbalance of power, the Palestinian Authority, continuing on what we've learned in chapter 8, it became a tool for Israel to manage the occupation instead of a force to liberate the Palestinians. The stipulated security arrangements in the accords were unfair to the Palestinians because they were prioritizing Israeli security, and the economic dependence of the Palestinians on Israel was entrenched on those accords. Also, the fragmentation of the West Bank made a geographically contiguous Palestine more difficult. So this aimed to kill the prospect of a Palestinian state. Also, the international perception entrenched by the occupation by perpetuating the myth that Israel wants peace. So in short, the Oslo Accords were not a genuine process, as Ilan concluded. They were rather giving Israel giving the appearance that they want peace. Okay, so moving on to chapter 9, Pape talks about the narratives surrounding Gaza, its population, and the history behind it. In the first myth, he talks about Hamas as a terrorist organization. He shows how the movement came to power due to a long line of false predictions by Israel and its backers, namely the United States. Or lastly, They saw that Hamas as a counterbalance of power to the secular movement Fatah. At that time, Western powers viewed secular and national movements as the worst enemy, especially those radical nationalists. Obviously, they wish to return back to those times now. Another example is in 1976, Rabin allowed municipal elections in which Palestinians overwhelmingly voted for the PLO. So I was reading something by Chomsky, and he was like saying everybody actually expected that, except the politicians in Israel and the US. It was apparent to everyone that that the Palestinians are going to vote for the PLO. But again, they were in their ivory towers trying to judge from above. And this is also a pattern that repeats of like making false predictions about what happens in politics in Palestine and in the West Bank and Gaza, trying to control those political situations by making pre-assumptions about them. So moving on from these two examples and fast forward, Hamas won the elections in 2006, the general elections. They gained popularity by opposing the joke of the Oslo Accords. Then they tried to capture the minds of the youth due to the daily hardships of the living under occupation. They provided schooling, medicine, welfare, and they attempted to genuinely alleviate the suffering of ordinary people. But also due to the death of Arafat, let's call it that, and the leader of the PLO, and the withdrawal of Israel from Gaza, which we're going to discuss later, that left like a political vacuum for Hamas to fill in Gaza, so we can understand the fuller picture. Pappé then talks about expert Israeli opinions that use the neoconservative models of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization, thesis that was oversimplistic to the cultural identities, deterministically telling from a Western-centric perspective, ignoring how cultures and civilizations typically interact and transform each other throughout history. They use that to demonize Palestinians as the other civilizations we inevitably need to clash with, without providing the broader context of oppression and disposition, and ignoring the diversity of the Palestinians who were living for centuries as Muslims, Christians, and historically Jews all together as one. Then he moves to talking about the population in Gaza. In 2005, particularly, Israel withdrew from Gaza, which is 2% of Palestine, and claimed it was a magnanimous gesture towards peace. Pappé shows again that this time it was a strategic move, same as we've seen in chapter 8 of the Oslo Accords. So this time Sharon wanted to solidify Israel's control over the West Bank by withdrawing from Gaza. He wanted to politically appeal to the leftist Israelis. He wanted Israel to absolve itself from the humanitarian situation of 1.8 million people back then in Gaza. Reflection, and whenever I say reflection, it's due to Edward Said's idea. So this is like a usual colonization strategy where they try to make apparent concessions that are actually putting more control. These are control mechanisms to deflect criticism internally and externally. So towards the Israeli, but also towards the international community. Moving on to the next myth that Pappé talks about. He mentions that he co-authored a book called The War on Gaza with Chomsky again. But then he started actually dropping the term war. He thinks it's not reflective of what was going on because of the assaults on the Strip since 2006. He started using the term incremental genocide. He provided two examples. In 2006, Israelis killed 660 citizens, more than triple that of the previous year, 200. 141 of them were children. The Israeli forces in 2006 demolished 300 houses, crushing entire families. Moreover, the situation of Palestinians worsened as a result of turbulence in the region, in Syria and Egypt, preparing Gaza for what he called a death sentence. So that was when the book was written. I think it was published in 2017. So yeah, that was before that. So moving on to another sub-myth, as I would call them, this time that the siege was peaceful. So in this one, Israel claims that the blockade around Gaza is a peaceful means aimed at security. Pappé says that it's actually a collective punishment mechanism that impacts the civilian population daily lives severely. Generally, measures framed was that discourse of security tried to obscure the violent and repressive nature of such measures. So whenever security is mentioned in the political context, we need to look for the underlying incentives. Then Pappé emphasizes the artificial separation created by Israeli policies. In this case, the sub-myth is the Gaza is a separate entity from West Bank. He talks about that this is a policy to undermine the Palestinian unity, portraying Gaza and West Bank as separate entities. And as a reflection on that from Edward Said's, this is a colonizing practice aimed at dividing the indigenous population to weaken their collective resistance. This one is about Gaza's self-governance, and there's a claim that Gaza has been self-governed since the withdrawal in 2005, while in fact Israel retained control over the borders, the airspace, and the resources, effectively making Gaza a mega prison that is guarded from outside and monitored. The next one is about the unilateral aggression, another claim or myth that Israel keeps mentioning. They say that the violence is one-sided, but Pappé provides a more nuanced view of the cycles of violence. He says it's not that as Israel tries to portray it, as it starts with Hamas doing something or some violence in a general sense on the Palestinian side. He says it's a continuous cycle of violence where Israel continually upscales the amount of violence it applies. One pattern here is that Israel prepares for a fight and tries to elicit a response that is then used to start the actual fight. And he gives two examples of that here as well. One is that for the first time when the Hamas missiles reached Tel Aviv, the missiles caused little damage and no casualties, but Israel responded with killing 200 Palestinians. The other case in 2014, a pretext for the abduction and killing of 3 settlers in the West Bank, Israel started an operation that it was already preparing for 2 years, called Protective Edge, during which 2,200 Palestinians were killed. So you can see the upscaling and the continuous upscaling of violence on the side of Israel. Two reflections here. This is a narrative erases what Edward Said calls the structural violence of the occupation to delegitimize the resistance, in this case generally seeking to blame the colonized for their own suffering. And this is a critique, I think, of the one-sided narrative of the Western media overall that favors the Israeli perspective. That the Israeli officials now became accustomed to manufacturing lies, reinforcing them about the Arab world, including Palestinians, to justify political agendas. This one is about humanitarian and aid and the freedom flotillas. Since 2010, there were tens of international freedom flotillas to break the siege, and so solidarity from the world. And this graph on the right depicts that. As you can see, many of those faced interference, interception, sabotaging, prevention from the. In some cases, activists were detained and the ships were destroyed. And in 2010, in a famous case, 9 activists were killed. As a reflection on that, even though humanitarian aid can be much needed, especially in today's circumstances, what we want to point out is that it can also help the colonizers placate and manage the problems, claiming that they're allowing this humanitarian aid instead of addressing the underlying root cause of the colonization. As a summary, Pappé in chapter 9, the Gaza Mythologies, considers a holistic narrative that incorporates the historical context and the on-ground realities of Palestine in a complex socio-political framework that helps us understand what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miró. That was absolutely brilliant. I had a couple of comments of my own, but you covered them all. Except one thing I wanted to mention is that divide and rule thing, that deliberate policy of making the colonized pit them against themselves and make them fight, the inner fighting that they have, was actually encouraged by the Tony Blair's government. And that's something I didn't know when I read Ilan mentions that Tony Blair was instrumental in it. And of course, Britain knew how to do that because they did the same thing in Rwanda. They did the same thing in former colonies everywhere. There's one thing he mentions, which is that Israel really had no interest so much in they didn't covet the Gaza territory, but the book was published in 2017. I think the discovery of gas deposits happened afterward. So I think Israel definitely covets the Gaza territory, and it definitely wants that area along the Mediterranean. And I know that they're planning, I mean, they're talking about it in the Israeli media and the Israeli government. They're planning to build Gaza. They want investment from the United Arab Emirates, and they're hoping to get some of the oil-rich countries that they wanted to normalize relationships with them, especially because they want investment there, and they're dreaming of creating some kind of a futuristic city. The Palestinians will have no place in it, of course. And it's very sinister. And just one more thing I wanted to say is that he mentions that some actions against Palestinians are a way of experimenting and testing the water. So Israel has a long history of that. They try technology, they try policies, they tried for different reasons. They try to see how it affects the population, what happens, how many people die, basically. Another thing they're trying to see is what will be the international reaction, what will the US do, what will the UN do, what will the UK do, what will the world do. So Israel is constantly testing the water. And what stands out for me in that is the dehumanization, the fact that it's so cynical and so wicked and so evil that it doesn't matter that these are people we're talking about, which made me think of the Americans' experiments in the Bikini Atoll, for example, after the Second World War, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where they used the local people there, basically literally used them in experimenting on them to see what the impact of nuclear fallout was on them. John Pilger talks about it extensively in his documentary. John Pilger, he's passed away recently, but I think his website's still up and you can still see all his documentaries. And one of them is The Coming War on China, where he actually covers the whole experience on the Bikini Atoll. But the point is, imperialist countries, colonialist countries treat the people that they colonize, they conquer, with complete disregard. There's no regard at all to their humanity. And Israel has not invented anything new. Hopefully see everybody next week, and I'll be actually very sad to finish this, but all good things, you know.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.